G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar with Jeff Goodell about his new book, Heat: Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Thank you so much for joining us today and helping us to create Australia's biggest book club. Before we begin today's conversation with Jeff, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work here in Canberra. It's Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to the tens of thousands of years of custodianship of this land and country. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And if you haven't checked out the Uluru Statement from the Heart ahead of this year's referendum, head on over to their website, please. Days and times for our webinars do vary, so please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for details of our upcoming webinars. Next week, we'll be talking to the Human Rights Law Centre's Kieran Pender about the Whistleblower Project. That should be a great one to check out. And if you do like our webinars and want to help keep supporting them, please head on over to our website to become a regular giver. It helps us to attract the fabulous guests that you know and love and enjoy. And just a few tips before we begin today to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of Jeff, and you can also put questions. You can also comment on other people's questions and upvote them as well. And a reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll kick you out. And lastly, a reminder that this is being recorded. You can find that up on our YouTube channel later today, and it will also be turned into a podcast on Follow the Money. So I was just reading in the news this morning on US news site Axios that over half the US population, or about 170 million people, are under heat alerts as a dangerous heat dome lingers over the majority of the Midwest, South, and Southwest of the United States. Greece and many other countries have also been hit hard by heat waves and wildfires, or bushfires, as we call them here in Australia. And just last month, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned that the era of global warming has ended and the era of global boiling has arrived, after scientists confirmed that July was on track to be the world's hottest month on record. So today we are going to delve into one of the most urgent and pressing challenges of our time, the escalating heat waves and extreme temperatures that are reshaping our world, with New York Times bestselling author and award-winning journalist Jeff Goodell. He's a contributing editor to Rolling Stone. Congratulations on the book and welcome, Jeff. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I've got the book just here. This is what it looks like for those of you who haven't yet ordered or bought your copy here in Australia. Jeff, congratulations. It's a really compelling read. I found it really hard to put down. You've obviously been reporting on climate change for many, many years now, and you've written several books. What made you concentrate on heat for this book and its the impacts from climate change?
Usually books come out of a strange place. It's hard to identify, where you got the idea and why you decided to spend 3 years of your life working on it. But in this case, it was very straightforward. I happened to be in Phoenix, Arizona, about 4 years ago on a hot day. It was about, 44 C or something. I had to walk 15 blocks downtown to a meeting. And by the time I got to the end of the 15 blocks, my heart was pounding and I was feeling a little bit dizzy. And I realized this heat is brutal. And if I had to go another 15 blocks, I don't know how I would have, I obviously would have made it, but it would have been extraordinarily difficult. And this may seem like a totally banal and almost silly thing to say, but I had never thought about the actual physical risks of heat before that. I had been writing about climate change for more than a decade. I, of course, knew all about, warming, global warming, 2 degrees of warming, this and that. But the actual physical impacts of heat and what it meant could mean to a person and how dangerous it was never occurred to me until that walk. And then I thought, oh, this is interesting in the sense of, I know nothing about this. I know nothing about the warning signs of it. And I talked to a friend that night and I realized that I didn't even know what heat was. I know what temperature was, but if you would have asked me that night, what is heat? I could not even have explained it to you. So that was the sort of moment that launched me on this book, to really try to look at heat as an immediate, the immediate impacts of heat, not some sort of far away, distant concern about what's going to happen if we hit 2 degrees of warming or anything like that, but about the here and now, and to look at it both in the immediate impacts and risks to our bodies, to our lives, but also in the sort of planetary scale of heat as this sort of primary driver of all the other climate impacts.
Yeah. So before we kind of delve into some of those impacts, as you were talking about, can you just tell us a little bit about the Goldilocks zone and kind of why that's been important to human history and evolution?
Yeah, so the Goldilocks zone is a phrase that planetary scientists use when they're searching for life on other planets. They're looking for the presence of liquid water, which is a good sort of sign that there could be potentially life there. So they're looking for places that are not too cold. Obviously, if it's too cold, there's no liquid water, it's ice. If it's too hot, the water vaporizes and there's nothing there. So they're looking for these places in between, which they call the Goldilocks zone. And I thought it was a very apropos for life on Earth here also. I mean, everything that around us, all us and all living things, evolved in a fairly stable climate over the last few million years. And we're very sort of good at maintaining our body temperature and thriving in this particular range of temperatures. But once we start to move outside of that range of temperatures, real trouble begins. And one of the big arguments in my book is that as the planet warms, as we get to these more and more extremes, we're pushing into the boundaries of this Goldilocks zone. We're pushing into the boundaries of the kind of climate and weather that we have evolved to deal with. And when we get to those boundaries, that's when the trouble begins.
Mm. Yeah, it's such a good way of thinking about it too. And I did just want to start, there's a couple of, well, there's more than a few kind of very grisly details of the human impacts of heat and stories in the book. But I wanted to ask you about the cautionary tale chapter and the deaths of a family of 3 in California. It was a really human way to have my entry into the book. And really, I thought immediately, helped a reader to grasp that this is a life and death kind of issue that we're talking about. What did the story straight for you and that you wanted readers to understand?
Well, I wanted readers to understand sort of what I understood on the street in Phoenix that day when I went for that walk, that heat is a deadly force that can have severe impacts on you or kill you very quickly. And this family that I wrote about, they lived in Silicon Valley, and then during the pandemic, they decided to move into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains in California, start a new life. Jonathan Garish was 43 years old. His wife, Ellen Chung, was in her late 30s, and they had a 1.5-year-old daughter. And they were outdoors kinds of people. They were in good health. They were, your average kind of adventurous, happy-go-lucky kind of young couple, very giddy about raising a child and starting this new life together in the mountains. They decided to go for a walk one day. It was about a 7 mile or what is that, 10 kilometer or so walk just down to this river to explore it for a swimming hole. And they hiked down to the river, and they had been warned the night before that it was going to be hot. And it got up to about 41 or 42 was the forecast for the next day. So they knew, and they started out really early in the morning. They got to the river, they hung out the river, played around, and then they realized that to get out, they had to hike up this really steep switchback canyon for about 3.5 kilometers. That was a difficult climb and directly exposed to the sun. And like most of us who don't understand the risks of heat, I probably would have done the same thing. I thought, oh, that's going to be hot, but I'll be fine. And they started out on the hike, and they were not fine. The next day, it became clear to their friends that they hadn't returned from the hike. the police sent out a search party, and they found the entire family dead on the side of the trail from heat stroke, including the family dog also. A tragic story, terrible in many dimensions, but I wanted to tell it because I really wanted to underscore that heat is a risk to all of us. It's not just to older people with heart conditions or just to outdoor workers who happen to be sweating in particularly difficult outdoor kinds of jobs, or I wanted the everydayness of it, the immediacy of it. And I felt like telling this story as powerfully and as sort of, it was a difficult story to tell because it's very sad, as sensitively as I could would be a good way to kind of engage the reader in the stakes of what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And when we're talking about this kind of thing, as you said, it can happen very quickly and very easily, and we don't necessarily appreciate that. And I was really struck by when you were talking about that idea of the Goldilocks zone earlier, that we have this idea that, global warming is just the difference of a couple of degrees on a summer's day. But it looks very different in a lot of places, and it actually doesn't take a lot for the human body to succumb to the impacts of heat. You also kind of talk about that, the role of workers and people who have to be outside and can't, like you and me, sit in an air-conditioned room and work on a computer. I'm always struck in Australia by when we have heat waves and extreme heat, that the media often portrays these with vision of people going to the beach or the pool to cool down. And it's kind of reported in this really quite a positive way. But what does it look like for workers who are exposed to this extreme heat as part of their everyday work?
Well, I mean, outdoor workers are among the people who are most at risk in these kinds of extreme heat conditions, because not only are they outdoors in the heat, but as you're exercising, just as that family was climbing up the mountains, the mountain slope, when you're exercising, whether it's pounding nails on a rooftop or laying asphalt on a highway or delivering the post in a hot neighborhood, that exercise builds up heat in your body too. So you need even more kind of relief, and you're more vulnerable even than someone who just happens to be sort of sitting under a tree or something out there, right? So outdoor workers are the ones who are most at risk, and the ones who need the most kinds of protections, and whose jobs are often put them in. I wrote about the death of a field worker in my book who, he had crossed over he was an immigrant had crossed over the border in Texas to find work here at a nursery, where they were growing plants for landscaping, and was trying to send money back to his family. And there's no worker protection laws, in the U.S. certainly at that time. Since his death, there has been a few passed in the state of Oregon where he died, but unless you have strong worker protection laws that require people to take breaks and seek shade and cool spaces, these workers are incredibly vulnerable, and they are the front lines of this sort of, in the book I call heat, a kind of predatory force, and heat preys on those kinds of folks first, and they're the ones whose lives are most at risk in these escalating temperatures.
You talk a lot about the impacts of heat in kind of different places across the world. A big focus, obviously, on the United States, where you're from, but you kind of touch on the human health impacts and the deaths that result from extreme heat in a number of different places. You specifically refer to that summers in Paris used to be very pleasant, very temperate, often rainy, but how in 2003, something like 15,000 people died as a result of a heat wave. I know here in Australia, the Adelaide morgue in 2009 ran out of room in the morgue for all the people that died as a result of a heat wave here. How prepared are cities and towns around the world for these increasing extreme heat days and heat waves that we're going to be experiencing more frequently?
No, I mean, not prepared at all. I mean, obviously some cities and places are a little more thoughtful about it than others, but, here in the United States this summer, we've seen that proven over and over again. I mean, the emergency rooms and things in Phoenix, Arizona have been overrun. I live in Austin, Texas. We don't even have public cooling centers that are open during the day during these extreme heat waves we've had. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the awareness of the risks of extreme heat are vastly sort of unprepared for. Especially, I mean, compare it to something like a tropical storm or a cyclone or something where you have and I've been in Australia when a cyclone hit, and I've seen it for myself. I was in Proserpine in, I think it was 2015, when we were hit by a big storm there. And I see how good the government is and public health officials are at warning people, at getting people prepared, talking about evacuation routes, talking about what to do when the storm hits. There's a very, very well-established sort of emergency management system for things like that. There's nothing like that for heat, certainly not anywhere I've ever been. I mean, there are, little heat alerts that beep out on your phone sometimes, but, most people have no idea how dangerous heat is, what to do about it, how to manage it. There's been talk about a ranking system similar to what there is for storms, category 1, category 2, category 3, category 4, even perhaps naming heat waves, things like that would help to bring people's awareness to these extreme heat events. But it's really tricky because, a tropical storm, you look out the window and if the wind is blowing, 20 kilometers per hour or 100 kilometers per hour, it's pretty obvious, right? The trees are bent in half, the roofs are flying off houses. With a heat wave, if you look out the window, you can't tell if it's 30 C or 45 C until you go out there and you run into the sort of wall of heat. So it's visually much more complex to kind of communicate about and warn people about, and for our own selves to process the risk that this kind of heat poses for us.
I just want to stick with the human impacts for a little bit. I can see some people in the comments kind of asking things like, well, didn't this family and this worker have a hat on and access to water? But you were kind of talking about in the book the fact that you can be hydrated and sometimes even in the shade, and your body, it can still succumb to the impacts of heat. Why is it so dangerous in particular for humans? And is there kind of a point that we need to be worried about, like in terms of the heat impacts on our own bodies?
Well, okay, so the first part of the question is, we humans have basically one mechanism for dealing with heat, right? And that is sweat. So when our bodies begin to overheat, and it doesn't take much. I mean, everybody knows how sensitive our bodies are to internal temperatures. If you're not feeling well and you go to the doctor, the first thing they do is take your temperature. And if you have a temperature of, just a degree or two above normal, they become concerned, and it's a sign that something is wrong. And so when our body starts to heat up, the first thing that it does is it starts sort of pushing. Your heart starts pounding faster and faster, and your heart starts pushing, your capillaries and veins dilate, and you begin pushing some more blood out towards your skin, where it circulates beneath the skin, and you sweat, and that sweat carries the heat away and cools the blood under the skin. And that works fine as long as, first of all, it's not so humid that the sweat doesn't really evaporate, which is one of the reasons why in many ways, wet heat is more dangerous than dry heat because of the evaporation qualities of the sweat. But also at a certain, it only works to dissipate a certain amount of heat. I mean, there's a lot of evidence showing that even if you're well hydrated, if the temperatures are too high, and if you're exercising too hard, you can still have a heat stroke because the sweat mechanism only works so well. And then, once your body temperature starts to rise and the sweat mechanism can't keep up with the cooling necessary, it puts tremendous strain on your heart because your heart keeps pounding and pounding and pounding. And many people who succumb to heat stroke, it's really their hearts that give out. And it's one of the reasons why diagnosing heat stroke is so difficult, because unlike a gun, it doesn't leave a wound on your body. Heat does not leave a wound like a gun does, a gunshot. It's just, this person had a heart attack, and you have to do a lot of contextual understanding to see that, it was the heat that really pushed the person's heart to this level. So that was the first part of your question. Well, I forgot now what the second part of your question was.
Oh, I think it was, you've got to where I wanted to go to, that idea that, if it's really.
The thresholds. The thresholds.
Yeah, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, there has been some research showing that, a 35 C wet bulb temperature, wet bulb meaning, taking into account humidity and other factors, is something like some kind of a thermal limit for humans. But it depends very much on your age, your health, what you're doing. I mean, every human has a thermal limit, but every living thing has a thermal limit. But I don't want to suggest that there's some sort of bright line where when it gets to X temperature, we all are just going to kind of drop dead. It depends on, what you're doing, how good a shape you're in, how strong your heart is, how long you're exposed to the temperature, many factors.
I want to come now to some of the impacts other than on humans. Obviously, this has a profound impact on the environment and other living creatures. You talk about things like animals being on the move and going into different areas. The fact that, for example, beetles have exploded in certain areas that eat away at forests and things like that. What are some of those impacts on the natural world that we're seeing?
Well, I mean, one of the most heartbreaking ones, and the one that, I'm moved by every time I think about it and write about it, is the reefs, is the obvious example. The Great Barrier Reef, which I've visited a number of times, been various parts of it, Heron Island and other places. And, reefs are the great example of a living organism that is extremely vulnerable to changes in temperature, because unlike some animals and plants, and humans, what we traditionally do when it gets too hot is we move. When our Goldilocks zone is, we're moving out of our Goldilocks zone, we move to a cooler place. And, that's what mosquitoes do. That's what, lots of marine creatures do. Lots of plants do. I mean, it's what a living creature does, is to try to migrate to a more thermally tolerant zone. But a lot of things can't migrate, right? I mean, a coral reef can maybe migrate over millions of years, but of course the problem is we're heating things up very quickly. So stuff like reefs are extremely vulnerable. When I was reporting this book, I wandered around the Botanic Gardens in Melbourne, and one of the great oak trees there had just fallen. And I won't say that climate change and heat was what killed it, but on the little placard, the sign on the tree talked about heat and drought stress. Were one of the causal factors in the death of this great oak. That great oak can't just move, right? I mean, it can't just like put itself on wheels and, move to a cooler climate. So, another writer that I know has talked about what he calls the great rearrangement. And that's sort of what we're going to be seeing as these temperatures increases. We're going to see this great rearrangement of living things as they try to move to more hospitable zones. And the ones that do will thrive and survive and maybe even do better in these new places. But others won't. And those that can't move will die. And that's one of the sort of, great and tragic dynamics of this rapidly warming world we're living in.
You've got a chapter that deals with the impact on marine life in particular, as you mentioned. You touch on the impact on coral reefs, but what is the blob for people who haven't heard of that before, and what kind of impacts did that have?
Well, the blob was the name given, kind of nickname given by some scientists to a marine heat wave that was off the coast, the west coast of the United States in the Pacific about 6 years ago. And, we tend to think about heat waves and extreme heat in the context of the land. It's where we live, it's where we have, that's where we see. But heat waves happen in the ocean also. And the blob was a particularly brutal heat wave that manifested itself in the Pacific and had a devastating impact on marine life along the California coast, wiping out all kinds of really important sort of linchpin species like starfish and others along the coast. I went diving into a kelp forest in Monterey, which the marine scientists I was with talked about being a great example of the devastation that this marine heat wave had caused. And one, because of the currents and other reasons, one part of this cove was relatively protected. And it was a beautiful kelp forest full of marine life and one of the most beautiful dives I've ever been on. And the other half of the cove, just a few kilometers away, which had been exposed to this this heat wave, was just barren. It was just a carpet of sea urchins, an invasive species that thrived in these kinds of hotter, more difficult conditions. And it was really, again, heartbreaking to see these two ecosystems side by side, one devastated by a marine heat wave and one protected from it. But it's not the kind of thing that, unless you're a marine scientist or a reporter out there working on a book and wanting to see things for themselves, that most people understand and think about, right? It's not front of mind, which is part of the tragedy of the oceans in general, right? For everything from deep sea mining to overfishing and everything, is that it's not part of the imagination of most humans on this planet, sadly.
I can see that we've got 520 people on the line with us. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm going to come to questions from the audience in just a few minutes. So if you've got them, please type in your questions for Jeff and we'll get to them in just a minute. Jeff, I wanted to ask, you visited the polar regions as well in this book, both Antarctica and the Arctic. We often think of Antarctica here in Australia, as being there perennially, and you kind of found that the heat impacts there are pretty dramatic in and of themselves. It's lasting a little bit better than the Arctic, but is that starting to change?
Yeah, so my trip to Antarctica was one of the most fascinating parts of my reporting for this book. And a lot of people say, well, why did you go to Antarctica? Isn't your book about heat? Isn't that the coldest place on the planet? Why would you go to Antarctica? I went to Antarctica first because I got invited on a scientific research trip, and I'd always wanted to go to Antarctica. And anybody who cares about climate science or about the Earth in general, basically wants to or should want to go to Antarctica. So there was that, but it was a chance to really look at how even small changes in heat can have big impacts. And we were talking about the oceans a minute ago, and this was a case in point. So I went there with some British and American scientists who were looking at West Antarctica at a place called Thwaites Glacier, which is a enormous glacier that acts as a kind of cork in the West Antarctic ice sheet that holds back the rest of the ice sheet from slipping into the Southern Ocean. And to be very brief about it, what's going on in Thwaites Glacier and in West Antarctica there is that a change in the warming of the Southern Ocean of just about 1 degree, hardly any, a very, very, very minor change, is changing the dynamic beneath the ice sheet where the ice sheet meets the land, and it's allowing the little bit warmer water to get underneath these enormous glaciers and ice sheets and beginning to destabilize them from below, which is leading to the potential for these giant ice sheets to begin to kind of collapse from below instead of melting from above the way the ice sheets in Greenland are. And you can see these moulins, these big meltwater streams running off the glaciers in Greenland. In Antarctica, it's an entirely different dynamic, and they're kind of melting from below. And Antarctica is holds a tremendous amount of ice, and the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is the one that's most at risk here, and the people who are researching, holds enough ice to raise sea levels about 10 feet. So what, 3 meters? So the stakes are enormous, and it's all because of the change in water temperature of 1 degree. And I thought that was a great way to think about the enormous implications of small changes of heat, not to mention big changes of heat, which we've also talked about.
I'll come to questions from the audience in just a second, but I did just want to wrap up, I guess, with what the problem is and how we can, what are our options for tackling this issue. So obviously fossil fuels is, the main cause of global warming. Australia is one of the biggest exporters of fossil fuels in the world. What are the options that you kind of go through for our responses that we can do to respond to the impacts of heat because of climate change?
Well, yes, I mean, eliminating fossil fuels is job one. This is what's burning fossil fuels is primarily what's driving these increasingly warmer world and these heat extremes. And it's very clear that our world is going to continue to get warmer until we stop putting CO2 into the atmosphere. When we hit net zero CO2, the warming will level out. But until we hit net zero, which is a long way off, as everyone I'm sure here on this call understands, we're going to continue to warm up. And stopping, slowing, eliminating, whatever phrase you want to use, fossil fuels is by far the most important thing. And then there's different kinds of ways that we can think differently about how we build our world and live our lives that can help us to think differently about the risks of heat. The first thing is simply getting smart about it, getting educated about it, understanding what the risks are, understanding the difference between dry heat and wet heat, understanding the difference in vulnerability of pregnant women and children, and your own vulnerability if you have any kind of heart conditions or circulatory problems and things like that. We can do things like pass laws to require outdoor workers and others to have shade breaks and water breaks to protect them. We can, I could go on a long rant about air conditioning, which I won't do right now, but air conditioning is not a silver bullet for the problem of extreme heat, but democratizing air conditioning, getting it to more people who currently can't afford it is certainly important. More public cooling spaces, cities that are not just sort of empires of asphalt and concrete, that have more natural green spaces, more trees, more shade, more access to cool places. Like here in Austin, we have a big naturally spring-fed pond in the center, or pool in the center of the city, that is just a godsend during these extreme heat moments. thinking differently about that. You know, we're going to have to think differently about the food. We haven't really even talked about the impact on food crops and things like that. There's a lot to do.
Mm. I'm going to come now to questions from the audience. And the first one is from Stephen Masters. And he asks, how is it possible to introduce a real and meaningful sense of urgency given the kind of prevailing business as usual approach to this issue?
Well, that is a very, very, very good question. And that is the question of our time, I would say. You know, I don't know what the, you know, solution to that is. What will be the thing that kind of wakes people up. You know, 15 years ago, I had a conversation with Al Gore, just a casual conversation, and he said, everybody who cares about climate change has an oh shit moment, where they kind of, something happens, whether it's, you know, I asked President Obama what his oh shit moment was, and for him, it was seeing the decline of the coral reefs in Hawaii, where he grew up. And for me, it was visiting the coal mines in West Virginia and seeing the consequences of mining and burning coal. But whatever it is, everybody has a moment. And for a long time, I thought, okay, you know, collectively as a society, as the civilized world, will have a collective oh shit moment where we will wake up. You know, politicians will say, we need to take action on this, and something will get done in that kind of dramatic way that we all hope and believe would happen, and mobilize to really deal with this. But I no longer think that we're going to, that this oh shit moment thing is, I think everybody will have and does have their own, but the idea that we're going to have some kind of collective wake up moment, and that there's going to people who think that climate change is some hoax perpetuated by Bill Gates or George Soros or whatever, are going to all of a sudden realize that it's real, that it's dangerous, that the future of human civilization is at stake. I just don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be trench warfare every day, passing legislation, getting people politically active, just you know, fighting tooth and nail to shut down coal plants, to move more quickly to renewable energy, to build more humane cities, and all of that.
I've got a question here from Paul Hellard, who asks about the Antarctic in particular, and wonders how long until scientists think that the Thwaites Glacier unplugs, and if you can just update us on that, I guess.
Wow, another great question. There's, you know, a lot of uncertainty around that, and that's one of the things that the trip I was on was trying to understand. You know, until, you know, I mean, the first scientists who really began to understand the potential instability of West Antarctica was a scientist named John Mercer in the 1970s. And he was sort of a lone wolf talking about this idea of, it's called marine ice cliff collapse, the instability that is caused by this melting at the bottom of the ice sheets. And the idea that the West Antarctic ice sheet could kind of tumble into the Southern Ocean like a big pile of ice cubes or something. And, you know, you know, there's a wide range even now, well, not even now. The more we learn about it, the more certain scientists have become that the instability there is real, the potential for dramatic change is real. I don't think any scientist I've talked to thinks it's going to happen tomorrow or in a decade, but, you know, they're some of the best ice scientists in the world, people like Richard Alley, who at Penn State in the United States, who I've talked to extensively about this, you know, won't rule out, you know, potentially 1.5 meters or 2 meters of sea level rise from West Antarctica by the end of this century, which is mind-boggling to think about. So, you know, it's very complex physics, ice sheet collapse. It's very complex understanding the sort of thermal dynamics of what happens as this little bit warmer water gets underneath these ice sheets. But nothing that I've, you know, learned in the 3 years that I've been researching and thinking about, 4 years I've been thinking about Antarctica and talking to scientists, have encouraged me to think that it's more stable rather than less. I think all the evidence is moving towards that it's less stable than we think.
Mm. You mentioned that we hadn't had time to touch on the impacts on agriculture and farming in particular. So I was going to ask you about that. We've kind of touched on the fact that plants can't exactly migrate to a different, cooler spot, but what kind of impact is heat having on the way we produce food?
Well, I mean, food crops are just like other plants, which are just like humans, and they have their Goldilocks zones too, right? And so, as we move into this new climate era with these more extreme temperatures and changes also, of course, in rainfall, which are a big issue for crops, we're starting to see a lot of crop failures in places where we didn't see it before. In my particular case in this book, I spent a lot of time in a place called the Rio Grande Valley in West Texas, which is one of the most agriculturally productive regions in the United States. Basically everything grows there, and it's an amazing place. It's the fertile bottomlands of the Rio Grande Valley, and it's this sort of delightfully warm temperature sort of year round, and it's just a kind of paradise for agriculture. And even there, we're starting to see that a lot of crops are reaching their thresholds. Corn, for example, there's massive declines in corn productivity in these parts of Texas. We're seeing wheat crops in Africa reaching their sort of thermal limits and having massive crop failures. And one of the interesting things is that I think that certainly I was biased when I began my research into thinking about heat impact on food supply, that that we could, because, like, for example, corn is so engineered, right? I mean, they're as engineered as a Lamborghini, in the sense of how we've messed with the DNA and breeding, the sophistication of breeding programs and things like that. And I kind of had the notion that we would kind of breed our way out of this problem with heat and crops. But after spending a lot of time talking to a lot of scientists, that's far more complicated than it first seems, because heat is not like blue eyes. It's not a trait that is simple, that you can just tweak a few genes. You put in a gene for a kind of crop that grows in hot weather, and you can grow the corn anywhere, kind of thing. It's heat tolerance is something that's deeply wound into the genetic structure of plants and, of course, of humans. So simply breeding our way out of this is not going to be easy. And then there's the notion of, we'll just shift, growing of whatever crop you want to name to a cooler climate, right? To a cooler latitude. And in some cases that might work, but there's all kinds of other complexities, like soil, for example, and light, and the culture of the farmers and the people who are growing the crops. So it's a really major concern that we're beginning to see the consequences of now, and I think is going to accelerate. And of course, the thing that makes crop failure, heat-driven crop failure, so scary is that food shortages are a obvious precursor to migration. If people can't eat, they move to somewhere where they can get food. It's also a major precursor, and that kind of migration and hunger is a major precursor to conflict. And so the politics of crop failure is really alarming.
The next question I've got is from Jim Roundtree, who asks, how worried are you about disruption to ocean currents? I'm not sure if that's a reference to the jet stream or the blob or the Antarctic ice shelf, but yeah, how would you respond to that one?
I think he's talking about the AMOC, the sort of overturning system, like the Gulf Stream, similar to the Gulf Stream that runs in the Atlantic, is one of the major redistribution of heat in the Northern Hemisphere. That's something that has been talked about a lot. I didn't really get into that in my book. That was just a kind of bridge too far. I know that there's been some new research showing the slowdown of the AMOC is happening faster than scientists had anticipated. It's something that's been in the sort of literature for a very long time. But I didn't really look at it in detail, so I don't feel like it's I'm qualified to really offer any kind of real insight into that.
No worries. The next question is from Michelle Smith, and she asks, could you explain the current situation and prospects for the current heat wave in the United States?
Well, the current situation is that it's really, really hot. I'm in the middle of it in Austin, Texas, and we've had, I think today's the 44th day above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So what's that? 38 C. It's really extreme, fatiguing. It's alarming. It's this pressure dome, this heat dome that is sort of been created over the southern part of the United States. Heat domes are nothing new, but we're seeing, because of these larger changes in the sort of dynamics of the atmosphere and movement in the jet stream, a lot of atmospheric scientists are suggesting that is increasing the duration and the intensity of these heat domes. Currently, it's forecast to last for at least another week here, which will put us upwards of 2 months of this kind of extreme heat. And also because of this high pressure zone that has settled over us, especially has also meant no rain, which is big implications for an arid place, especially like Texas, where I live, where we're starting to see springs drying up, and farmers are very concerned, and all the implications that go with drought. And as everyone knows, heat and drought are forever interlinked.
The next question that I've got is from Wendy Cox, and she asks, do we know when, for example, the Northern Territory in Australia or other parts of Australia and elsewhere will become unlivable? Before I throw that to you, Jeff, I'll just say the Australia Institute has done a bunch of research around heat. We've got a project called Heat Watch, where you can look at the number of days over 35 that are forecast to increase in a couple of different places around Australia. I'm pretty sure including Darwin, so you can check that out on our website. And we also did some research that looked at analysis from the Bureau of Meteorology to track changes in daily temperature that mark the beginning of kind of the different seasons. And we found that summer temperatures were experienced for a full 31 days longer than the benchmark between 1999 and 2018, and that winter temperatures were experienced for 23 days less than the benchmark. So essentially summer is longer and winter is shorter in Australia. And you can find that on our website too. But yeah, I know, Jeff, you've said you don't want to kind of get into alarmism, but this idea that places will become extremely difficult to live, how is that with us already? How soon is that coming for places around the world?
Well, first of all, I want to be clear. I'm all for alarmism. I'm not for doomism. I'm not for that we shouldn't that it's all over, nothing we do matters or anything like that. But I think that we're not alarmed enough. I think that we are. And you could argue that my book is an attempt to kind of alarm people, to wake people up, and to wake them up, and so that they will get involved and take action and fight for a better world, and to reduce emissions, build cities differently, and all that kind of thing. So I just want to be clear that I'm not anti-alarmist. I'm anti-doomer, but I'm not anti-alarmist. So I think it's very, very alarming what's going on right now. And when you ask about when it will be, uninhabitable, any place, Darwin or Northern Territories or whatever, the question is always for who, right? I mean, so, what's uninhabitable for you and me is very different than what's uninhabitable for an unhoused person living on the street. And it's very different that for what's uninhabitable for, Bill Gates or Richard Branson or something, I mean, so there's not only that, but there's also like, well, what do you mean by habitable? Yes, you can survive in these maybe extreme temperatures, but maybe the world looks like a very different place. The flora and fauna are dramatically different. You have a different mix of people living there in very different kinds of places. It's not clear where we're going with adaptation. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can adapt to. I mean, obviously we sent people to the moon. You can, adapt for short periods of time to all kinds of things, but it really comes down to at what cost and for who. And so it's very difficult to simplify that, right? Because, like I'm here in Texas, it's been over 40 days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. A lot of my friends are saying, I can't take this. I'm thinking about moving. I don't want to live in a place where summer becomes this sort of like vampire season where, you don't want to go outside during the middle of the day or during a lot of the day because it's so hot and it's just so unpleasant. And so, whether they will actually move or not, I don't know. But, this question of habitability is just very complex.
Yeah, I've got a friend and colleague who used to live in Adelaide and talked about moving from somewhere cooler than that and experiencing an Adelaide heat wave. And kind of the first couple of days, you're like, I can get through it. And I'm got ice creams in the freezer and, all of these things to cope. And then at some point you just realize actually you just have to keep living your life in this extreme, unpleasant heat, like you were talking about in Austin. And that's just what the prospect of your everyday life is and kind of how difficult that is to come to terms with. The next question that I've got is from Kevin O'Day, and he talks about the fact that both major parties in Australia rely on donations from fossil fuel companies that end up or seem to dictate the policy on a lot of climate policies and issues. Is that also reflected in the United States? And what are some ways that we can respond to that or deal with that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that it's a basic rule, not just in the United States or in Australia, but everywhere in the world where fossil fuel companies operate and have power, that they use their power and money to influence policy. That's what they do. That is how the game is played. And how to limit that, how to reduce subsidies, how to reduce lobbying power, how to reduce political influence. There's all kinds of ideas about, passing different kinds of laws at different places and, the importance of sunlight, exposing, publicizing the media, writing about it, sunlight, the best disinfectant idea and all that. But ultimately it comes down to getting off of fossil fuels. The less we are dependent upon them for our own power and, as in Australia's case, for export, the less power that they will have, and the more political pressure that we can put on politicians to say, we are not going to live with this. We are not going to live in a world that is burning, and then you're giving millions or billions of dollars, or at least turning a blind eye to the fossil fuel industry. And I think the political momentum is everything. And the fossil fuel industry, I'm not a I live here in Texas. It's the capital of the fossil fuel industry, but a lot of my friends are in the business, and I understand that they've contributed greatly to human progress and all that. But I also understand that it's time for them to go, and this transition has to be made more quickly. And the way that's going to be made more quickly is by political influence and political power, and voters saying, no, we are moving faster, and we're not going to, allow this to continue.
The next question I've got is from Peter Todd, who admittedly says this is more a comment than a question, but reflecting on the difference between the title Heat here in Australia and elsewhere, he believes it's The Heat Will Kill You First. Can you tell us a little bit about that title and why you settled on that?
It's so interesting. I was just in Australia for a week, traveling around and talking about my book, and that question comes up virtually everywhere that I traveled and talked with people. And you know, it's a really interesting question. First of all, it was the idea of my Australian publisher to change the title from The Heat Will Kill You First to Heat. They believed that that title would be more effective in Australia than The Heat Will Kill You First. We didn't have a long conversation about it. My publisher, Black Ink, is a terrific publisher. I've been with them for a number of books. I think they do a great job, and I'm very proud of everything that I've done with them. And, you know, as a writer, I trust their judgment. You know, they have an idea about what works in Australia and what doesn't. And it doesn't reflect any changes in the text. It doesn't reflect any changes in my point of view. It doesn't reflect any changes in how I talk about anything. It's simply a decision, you know, that was made in an attempt to, you know, sort of more effective messaging. And I have to say that, you know, when I first came up with the title, The Heat Will Kill You First, it was very controversial among my friends and my brain trust and my publisher here. And we almost didn't go with it, but I'm glad we did, because I think that it really communicates the urgency of what we're talking about here. But I also think that Heat is a great title also, because it really captures the scope of the subject in a kind of dramatic, grand way that I think is completely appropriate to the book.
Yeah. Well, we are going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And thank you for your time, Jeff. The book is Heat, Life and Death on a Scorched Earth, if you're here in Australia, and The Heat Will Kill You First if you're elsewhere. But for supporters of the Australia Institute, we do have a discount offer. So you can perhaps email us, or you might have that already in your email if you have registered for this webinar. It's a cracking read, unputdownable. I breezed through it really quickly. It's covers so much and was just so fascinating to me, even as someone who's read and interacted with books about climate change for a long time now. So I highly recommend it. It should be at a bookstore near you, published by Black Ink Books. Thanks everyone for your amazing questions. As always, I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but if for whatever reason you need to revisit any of this, don't forget to check out the video recording of this on australiainstitute.tv, our YouTube channel. You can also find the recording up on our website, and it will come out pretty soon on our Follow the Money podcast. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Jeff. I hope the heat dome isn't too unpleasant for you, and that all your friends are safe and sound in Austin, Texas. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who joined us. It was a great conversation. I was really happy to be here.
Thank you. And as usual, a reminder, we've got a webinar next week with Kieran Pender from the Human Rights Law Centre. He's launching the Whistleblower Project, and we're going to be talking to him about the need to have stronger protections for whistleblowers in Australia and the important role that they play in our democracy and keeping it healthy. Thanks again, everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to Follow the Money, our podcast, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.